The room fell completely silent the moment my mother stood up and clapped her hands together. "Well," she said with a triumphant smile, "I suppose we'll have to decide whether to renovate the West Wing first or convert it into luxury vacation rentals." My father laughed. "We'll finally turn Mom's old mountain lodge into the family business it was always meant to be." Around the long oak conference table, distant relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody challenged them. They acted as if the inheritance was already theirs. The mountain lodge was worth nearly $1.9 million, sitting on hundreds of acres of pristine forest. It had been my grandmother's pride for over 40 years. My parents hadn't even waited for the attorney to finish opening the file. They were already dividing rooms, already discussing investors, already talking about our future. I sat quietly at the opposite end of the room, dressed in the same black dress I'd worn to Grandma's funeral 2 days earlier. Neither of them had acknowledged me. Not once. It was almost impressive how completely they'd mastered pretending I didn't exist. Then my mother finally noticed me. "Oh," she said with a fake smile, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I forgot you were invited." A few people looked away. Even the attorney paused. Dad smirked. "Don't get your hopes up," he said. "Grandma always had a soft heart, but sentiment doesn't change inheritance laws." Several cousins chuckled nervously. I simply folded my hands. "I understand," I replied. That only encouraged him. "You'll probably get one of her old photo albums." More laughter. Then the judge entered. Everyone stood. The official proceedings began. My parents looked completely relaxed. They had absolutely no idea they were about to lose everything. But that's not where this story began. 3 months earlier, when people hear that my parents abandoned me at 19, they usually imagine a dramatic argument. The truth was much colder. They simply decided I wasn't worth the effort anymore. After my first year of college, I came home expecting to spend the summer with my family. Instead, every lock had been changed. My belongings were stacked in garbage bags on the porch. My father opened the front door just enough to speak through the gap. "We've done enough," he said flatly. "You need to figure your own life out." I thought it was temporary. I begged. I cried. My mother never even came outside. She stood behind the living room curtain watching me struggle to carry everything I'd owned into the rain. That image stayed with me for years. Not because of the rejection, because she never looked guilty, only annoyed. That was their first mistake. Grandma found me sleeping inside my old hatchback 2 nights later. She didn't ask questions. She simply opened the passenger door. "Come home," she whispered. She gave me her spare bedroom. She helped me finish school. When I worked 2 jobs, she packed my lunches. When I doubted myself, she reminded me that kindness wasn't weakness. Meanwhile, my parents told everyone a completely different story. They claimed I'd become selfish, ungrateful, rebellious. According to them, I'd chosen to leave. Most people believed them. It hurt, but I never defended myself. Grandma always squeezed my shoulder whenever someone repeated another rumor. "The truth doesn't need to shout," she'd say. Remember that detail. It matters later. As years passed, my parents only contacted Grandma when they needed something. Money, loans, favors. She always helped. Not because they deserved it, because she refused to become bitter. Still, I noticed something changing. She started asking more questions about paperwork, about property taxes, about estate planning. Whenever I entered the room, she'd quietly change the subject. Nobody in that room knew the truth. Then her health declined. Doctors advised her to slow down. Instead, she insisted we spend every weekend together repairing the old lodge. She said she wanted me to know every beam, every trail, every hidden corner. I thought she was simply sharing memories. Now I know she was preparing me. The worst part was still ahead. My parents suddenly became attentive again. Flowers appeared every week. Expensive dinners. Long phone calls. Social media posts calling Grandma the heart of our family. It made me sick. They never visited when she needed groceries. They never showed up after medical appointments. But once they realized the property had nearly doubled in value, they transformed into devoted children overnight. Dad even brought contractors to inspect the lodge while Grandma was still alive. He called it future planning. She watched silently from the porch. She said nothing, but later that evening she smiled sadly. Interesting timing, isn't it? I nodded. Neither of us needed to say more. This is where everything changed. One afternoon she handed me a sealed envelope. If anything happens, she said, give this only to the attorney whose name is written here. I stared at it. What's inside? She smiled. Insurance. I wanted answers. She refused. You'll know when it's time. That mystery stayed with me for weeks. Then she passed away peacefully in her sleep. At the funeral, my parents cried louder than anyone. My mother collapsed into relatives' arms. Dad delivered an emotional speech about family unity. People applauded. I stood quietly in the back. Grandma would have hated the performance, but I remained silent. They mistook my silence for weakness. That was their second mistake. The will reading arrived 2 days later, which brings us back to that conference room. The attorney began reading. Small personal gifts came first. Jewelry, paintings, charitable donations. My parents barely listened. They whispered renovation ideas instead. Finally, the attorney reached the mountain lodge. Dad leaned back confidently. Mom smiled so broadly it almost looked painful. The mountain lodge, the attorney read, shall pass according to the attached legal structure established 6 months before my death. Confusion spread across the room. Dad frowned. What legal structure? The attorney calmly produced another folder. The property is no longer personally owned. Silence. Mom blinked. What does that mean? It means, the attorney replied, the lodge was transferred into a private family preservation trust. Dad laughed dismissively. Fine. We're the beneficiaries. The attorney looked directly at me. No. A ripple moved through the room. The sole trustee. He paused. And controlling beneficiary. My parents slowly turned toward me. Is my granddaughter? Gasps echoed around the room. Dad actually laughed. That's impossible. The attorney opened another document. There is more. He handed copies around the table. Grandma had recorded years of financial transactions. Every loan, every unpaid debt, every broken repayment promise, every attempt my parents had made to pressure her into signing over ownership. Even recordings of conversations, including one where Dad called her an obstacle standing between us and that property. Faces around the room turned pale. My mother's hands began shaking. No. The attorney continued. The trust specifically prohibits the sale, commercial development, or transfer of the lodge. Dad slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. The judge finally spoke. It is legally binding. Then came the final twist. The attorney unfolded Grandma's handwritten letter. If my children contest this will, he read, their remaining inheritance shall immediately transfer to the local children's housing charity. Mom's mouth fell open. Dad looked like he'd stopped breathing. If they truly cared about me, the letter continued, they already received everything that mattered while I was alive. If they cared only about my property, they deserve none of it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. One cousin quietly covered her mouth. Someone dropped a pen. The sound echoed through the room. My parents had trapped themselves. If they fought, they lost everything. If they stayed silent, they still lost the lodge forever. Years of manipulation collapsed in less than 5 minutes. Their confidence disappeared. Their empire existed only inside their imagination. That was their final mistake. Over the next several months, reality caught up with them. Relatives stopped believing their stories after hearing the recordings. Business partners quietly distanced themselves. Several family members demanded repayment of old debts they'd previously ignored. Their carefully crafted image collapsed piece by piece. Meanwhile, I honored Grandma exactly as she'd asked. The lodge remained untouched. Instead of turning it into luxury rentals, I restored it as a retreat where foster children, scholarship students, and grieving families could spend time in nature free of charge. Every improvement carried Grandma's name. Every visitor learned her story. People often asked whether I hated my parents. The answer always surprised them. No. Hatred would mean they still controlled part of my life. Grandma taught me something far more valuable. Peace isn't found by destroying people. It's found by refusing to become like them. The greatest revenge wasn't watching them lose the lodge. It was proving that the young woman they threw away at 19 became exactly the person they could never understand. Strong without cruelty, successful without greed, and surrounded by people who chose to stay. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with? Tell me your story in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more revenge stories every week.